The entire football world is waiting to see what will happen with Aaron Rodgers. If he's traded to the Jets, what will it take for us to look back on his time in New York as a success? We'll discuss that today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, February 27th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free, and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Well, everybody's waiting to see what will happen with Aaron Rodgers, and of course there are plenty of rumors about the Jets potentially trading for the future Hall of Famer. Today we're going to talk about what happens if Rodgers is traded to the Jets, and what will need to happen for us to look back on his time in New York as a success. And if you've been listening to the show, you know that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of this idea for numerous reasons, but I definitely think there are scenarios where this could work out very well. When I say I'm not a big fan of the idea of trading for Rodgers because of the price or because of his age, I'm not saying it's a lock to be a failure. The way I look at a situation like this is I try and imagine what would happen if you play out a scenario 100 times. And that's kind of the way I think you play out like an NFL season to determine whether a particular move is good or bad. You know, if you play out the 2022 season 100 times, Kansas City's not going to win 100 times. Kansas City's not going to be the Super Bowl champion every single time. There are going to be scenarios where Philadelphia wins it all. There are going to be scenarios where Buffalo wins it all. There are going to be situations where Cincinnati wins it all. You know, injuries, luck, they come into play in any individual scenario. So my feeling is that if Aaron Rodgers is traded to the Jets and you play out, I guess, and I'm assuming that he's going to be here for 2 years. If you play out those 2 years 100 times, I think more often than not the Jets end up in a bad spot. But you could very well end up in a situation where the Jets do catch lightning in a bottle, and you look back on the trade as a very successful one. And that's what I want to focus on today. Now, again, I'm playing under the assumption Rodgers is going to be with the Jets for 2 years if they trade for him. I could very well be wrong. That's just my guess based on his age, based on his contract, based on past players' performances and how they've declined at certain ages. You know, based on it seems like Rodgers doesn't really want to be around forever. You know, it seems like he's got other things he wants to move on to. So that's just my educated guess. It could be 3, could be 1, could be 4. We don't really know. But I'm playing under the assumption that he'll probably be with the Jets for 2 years. And I think the thing that makes Rodgers different from any other potential veteran quarterback the Jets could get is it's pretty much going all in, because I don't think that there's any scenario where the Jets could trade for Rodgers and the trade could be a success unless they win the Super Bowl at some point in the next 2 years. I don't think that's necessarily true with any other quarterback the Jets could get. I don't think it's true with Derek Carr. I don't think it's true with Jimmy Garoppolo. I don't think it's true with Ryan Tannehill. I don't think it's true with Jacoby Brissett. You name the other quarterback. I don't think it's true. Now, in that group, I think Carr is the only one that I think is likely to have a successful tenure with the Jets. But, you know, the other guys, they're more bridge quarterbacks to the future. They would be brought in to stabilize the team for a couple of years. You would expect steady play. You would expect them to end the playoff drought, make the playoffs a couple times, and then hand off the keys to a quarterback the Jets draft over the next couple of years. And hopefully that quarterback is the one that gets you to the Super Bowl. So, you know, any other quarterback, I don't think it's as dire of a situation. I don't think it's a situation where you need great results immediately. Now, you're going to need to make the playoffs with anybody else, but I don't think it's a scenario where it's necessarily if you would fail to win the Super Bowl with any of these other quarterbacks, you look back on the trade as a failure. I think with Rodgers, you know, making the playoffs is not good enough. Making the AFC Championship game is not good enough. I'd say making the Super Bowl and losing is not good enough. Now, I guess you could argue the Jets haven't been in the Super Bowl in over 50 years. Making the Super Bowl, you want to argue Jets get to the Super Bowl and lose, it's good enough. I can buy that, but nothing short of that for me. And I still say, you've got to win the Super Bowl. When you talk about price, because you're going to be probably inheriting that $60 million contract. You're probably going to have to give up some sort of draft compensation package, at least one good pick, maybe two. Maybe it's not a first round pick, maybe it's a day 2 pick. You're probably giving up something of value though for Rodgers, and you're only getting him for 2 seasons. And that's and I don't want to rehash the challenges I have, but I'll just say that if you have Aaron Rodgers for 10 seasons, you have Aaron Rodgers for 15 seasons, the odds you're going to win a Super Bowl at least one of those years is pretty good. You get him for 2 seasons, that's tough, especially 2 seasons at the end of his career. But it's possible. I think a lot of this is contingent on Aaron Rodgers returning to the Aaron Rodgers of 2019 and 2020. Because if you do that, then you do have a legitimate shot at making the Super Bowl. If you get Rodgers at his MVP level that he was those seasons, or younger, how he played in the earlier days of his career, then I think you do have a shot. I would guess, and it's kind of interesting. Late last week, I appeared on Locked On Sports Today with Peter Bukowski. You can check it out. We talked Derek Carr and Aaron Rodgers, and I went into some of the reasons I don't think it's necessarily the move that's in the best interest of the Jets, and I talked about why I think Jets should make a move for Derek Carr, and we discussed like kind of the situation the Jets are in at quarterback. And after we stopped recording, we kind of talked about it, and it was interesting because Peter said something to me. And he feels like the Jets should be in on the trade for Rodgers. And what Peter said to me was he thinks that the Jets are the 4th best team in the AFC with Rodgers. I said, yeah, well, I agree. And it's interesting how we came to different conclusions, because my view was that I'm getting Aaron Rodgers, I'm giving up all these resources, and I'm not even a top 3 team in the AFC. Peter argued when I spoke with him that but you got a legitimate shot at going into Cincinnati, going into Buffalo, and winning, and that's true. And I think that if you have the MVP Rodgers, then you would go into those road venues in the playoffs potentially, and you have a legitimate shot at winning those games. It could kind of be the path Tampa Bay took in 2020 with Tom Brady. Even though they were not the division champion in the NFC South, they went and won 3 road playoff games to get to the Super Bowl. Now, the first of which was against a Washington team that was not very good, a team that won a terrible NFC East. But the second 2, game in New Orleans in the Superdome, and then at Lambeau Field in Green Bay. Now, this was the COVID year, so, limited attendance, if any, in those games, so not a true road game. But Brady went on the road and beat tough teams to get to the Super Bowl. And Rodgers would give you that shot, especially with the defense the Jets have, especially with a talented group of young players, skill players, Breece Hall, Garrett Wilson. Would you get anything from anybody else? It's difficult to say. And of course, Rodgers, at his best, lifts any team up. The quarterback position in the NFL, that's really the position that makes the most difference in this league. If you have a good quarterback, it can cover for a lot of mistakes. In fact, I would say that if Zach Wilson had been a hit instead of a miss for the Jets, we would view Joe Douglas and we'd view Robert Saleh completely different. Joe Douglas's successes would be magnified if Zach Wilson was playing well at quarterback, and his failures would be hidden. And I think the same is true of Robert Saleh. But because Zach Wilson failed, Joe Douglas's failures really stick out. And his successes, you're happy he has had successes, but they just don't seem that great because the team hasn't really had the level of success you were hoping for. I think a lot of this is contingent on Rodgers being great. And of course, there is a scenario where Rodgers is still great. You can look back to last year in Green Bay and you wonder how much of it was because he was playing with a hand that was not fully healed most of the season. You wonder, there's a context where you could look at this, and part of this is me playing devil's advocate because, even though I'm kind of against a Rodgers trade, I think you have to be intellectually honest. You have to say that there's another side to the story. So today I'm trying to give you the other side of the story. And it's possible. I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but it's definitely possible that Rodgers was really hindered by that injury last year. And beyond that, there's a case to be made that the fact he gave the Packers even incredible quarterback play, the fact that he helped the Packers get close to the playoffs while playing injured, there's a scenario where that's pretty impressive. If he goes back and he's fully healthy and he's fully committed and he's motivated and he wants to show Green Bay wrong, he can make a big difference. I don't think there's any question that it's a possibility. So if you look at Aaron Rodgers, I don't think it takes a lot of analysis to say that if Aaron Rodgers is back to a guy who's in his prime, he could really lift the team up, and suddenly the Jets become a very interesting team in the AFC. But it's not just about Aaron Rodgers. There could be a more dynamic impact that Rodgers would bring to the team. He could potentially attract other players, other really good players, other big name players. And as we continue here on this Monday episode of Locked On Jets, we'll discuss the potential aspect of Rodgers bringing big names to the Jets if he comes to the Jets in a trade. That's as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Of course, we're in the NFL offseason, so we're just talking about potential offseason roster moves. We're talking trades. We could be talking free agency in a bit. We're at the midway point of the NBA season, however, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers and threes drained. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Today we're talking Aaron Rodgers. What if the Jets trade for the future Hall of Fame quarterback? And what if it all works out? What if Aaron Rodgers helps deliver the Jets their first championship in over 50 years? How will it happen? Well, of course, it has to begin with Aaron Rodgers returning to the MVP level he showed in 2019 and 2020. It begins with the soon-to-be 40-year-old quarterback coming in with something to prove, with a chip on his shoulder, fully committing to the team, fully committing to the playbook, fully committing to his conditioning. But I think Rodgers could have a dynamic impact on the Jets. I think it's easy, and maybe I fall into this trap a little bit too easily, of thinking that adding Rodgers means that you're only getting Aaron Rodgers. I think it would bring kind of a shift in strategy for the Jets, and I think you would see the Jets undergo the type of change we saw a couple of years ago when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers got Tom Brady. Because when they got Tom Brady, they didn't just bring in the quarterback. Brady helped them attract a lot of other big-name players, whether you're talking Rob Gronkowski, whether you're talking Leonard Fournette. There were other guys who just decided, big-name players, who were at the end of their careers, and maybe not the same level of impact, but guys who decided they wanted to team up with Tom Brady to try and win a Super Bowl. And I think that's the type of impact you could potentially see with the Jets. And, there's some big names out there. You could speculate, would it be Odell Beckham Jr., maybe some guys who potentially could be salary cap cuts. I'm speculating, Khalil Mack, Adam Thielen. I don't know. And I don't really know Rodgers' relationship with any of these guys. But the Jets would suddenly become a team where veteran players at the end of their career trying to chase a ring could be looking to team up with Rodgers the way they did with Tom Brady. And I think you would see a rather radical course the Jets would take, because the way the salary cap works in the NFL makes it very easy to manipulate from year to year. You may end up paying a player, say, $5 million this year, but you can structure a contract and you can restructure a contract so that of the $5 million you pay that player, maybe only $1 million of that counts against the cap this year. And you essentially push the other $4 million to future years. The Jets are going to have to do this to some degree anyway, because they're kind of a high up against the cap, and they're going to have to clear up cap space just to be able to afford, first of all, a veteran quarterback, and then other players who could help upgrade their roster. But you could take this to an extreme. That's something Tampa Bay kind of did, and they're going to pay the price for that, I think, over the next couple of years. But the question is to what degree the Jets want to take this. They could do it in a moderate way where it would kind of, it would be one of those things that would impact them mildly over future years. Or you could go all in. You could just decide, we are pushing all of our cap to the future. We'll deal with it then. And, we just want to win it all the next 2 years. And if you get Rodgers, I think that's probably the course you'll see the Jets go. And if you get Rodgers, that's probably the logical course, because, again, you have to win the Super Bowl in the next 2 years with Aaron Rodgers. Getting Aaron Rodgers is not a move about building an identity. It's not a move about trying to build your teams in a slow and steady way. It's essentially a bolt right there. It's essentially a bolt that you're saying we need to make this happen right now. So I think you would see a lot of big names potentially coming in. I think you'd see the Jets do everything in their power to limit their 2023 cap hits and push them into the future. It's a risky strategy. In fact, it's a strategy the Jets tried about 10, 12 years ago with Mike Tannenbaum. Now, a little nuance to that because one of the years the Jets tried this in 2010, it was actually a year with no salary cap. The year 2010 was actually played, it was a capless year in the NFL, and that's a story that's not that important. But essentially what the Jets did in the Mike Tannenbaum and early Rex Ryan years is they pushed a lot of cap hits to the future, and they restructured guys like Bart Scott and Calvin Pace. And part of it depends on how your guys age. Because if your guys age gracefully, you actually can have a soft landing. If you have guys who can stay with your team for 3, 4, 5 years and still play effectively, pushing the cap hits to the future doesn't necessarily impact you that greatly. It's if your guys age very quickly. And I think what the Jets would do is Jets would probably go out and get a bunch of guys who were near the end of their careers and guys who were, just, again, not really expecting to be here much longer. Guys kind of like Aaron Rodgers, because if you trade for Aaron Rodgers, what you're doing is you're taking on a $60 million salary this year. And this is just the way his contract is structured. This doesn't require the Jets to do anything other than pick up a bonus. But essentially what the Jets would do is they'd get Aaron Rodgers on a $60 million salary this year. His cap number would only be $15 million, though, and it would be the other $45 million would be paid over the next 3 seasons. So it would be 15 and 23, 15 and 24, 15 and 25, 15 and 26, and that's how you get to $60 million. And the Jets, I think, would do that over and over. I think you'd see a lot of big names in here, and you'd combine that with the young stars the Jets have in Breece Hall, Sauce Gardner, Garrett Wilson, and you would have like one of the biggest name rosters in the NFL, and you essentially would be going all in. And I say frequently, most of the NFL is somewhere in between win now and building for later. Most teams are balancing the two. They're trying to do both. At the very extremes, you do have the worst teams in the NFL, and like Houston this year would be an example, a team that has no shot, that's just completely thinking about the future. And then at the other extreme, you have teams, the Rams over the last couple of years, the Bucks over the last couple of years, they're just going all in. They don't care about future resources. They're just trying to make it happen now. And a Rodgers move would probably push the Jets into that category. And you'd see a lot of other guys come in, a lot of other big names, guys who maybe aren't as good now as their names would indicate, but guys who could probably still help the team. And with the young stars the Jets have, they could potentially turbocharge the Jets into a big run. If things break right for them at the right time, maybe the Jets could get lucky and end this long Super Bowl drought. But I do think there's one other potential impact of Aaron Rodgers. And again, it's like bringing in other big names. It's potentially hidden, but he could unlock some key players on this roster. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking Aaron Rodgers. I've made my views pretty clear on this. I don't think Aaron Rodgers is the right move for the Jets unless they're able to really cut his contract down. But I do think there's a pathway for the Jets to get Aaron Rodgers and still have success, even if I'm not thrilled with the contract. And the Jets really need to go on a Super Bowl run in the next 2 years. Now, how are they going to do it? Well, the first thing is that Rodgers has to be great again. None of this 2022 stuff. He's got to go back to last couple of years where he was spectacular, played at an MVP level again. That's number one. Number two is I think that Rodgers would probably help the Jets attract some big names in here. I think the Jets' salary cap strategy would be all about creating short-term space and pushing a lot of their payments to the future. So the short run, they'd create a lot of cap space. In the long run, they'd have some issues, but they'd worry about the long run when they got to there. But there's another thing that I think Rodgers could potentially do for this team, and it goes back to the role the quarterback has. If you have a great quarterback in this league, he can lift everybody up. And while Rodgers has not necessarily been known as a particularly great leader, there are some players on this roster who probably could benefit from him. And the first guy I look at is Elijah Moore. Now, I think with a quarterback like Rodgers, it would go one of two ways with Elijah Moore. Either he would play well and he would gain Rodgers' trust, or Rodgers would freeze him out. And Rodgers is kind of notorious for freezing out young receivers he doesn't trust, and he's not the easiest guy to play receiver for. But you look at Elijah Moore's 2 seasons with the Jets, in particular last year, he's kind of been an underachiever so far. And it's easy to blame the quarterback. The easiest thing in the world to do is when you don't get good quarterback plays to just blame the quarterback for all the ills of the team. But it's pretty clear that he's been a better receiver when his quarterback has not been named Zach Wilson. Elijah Moore's been better with Mike White. He's been better with Joe Flacco. And these are not really guys who are household names. These are not guys who really lift their teams up. If you give Elijah Moore somebody like an Aaron Rodgers, it can make a big difference. It could potentially turn Elijah Moore into a legitimate player. And there are other guys you could look at. If you have to worry about Aaron Rodgers' playmaking, it's going to make Breece Hall better because suddenly Breece Hall can't be the focal point of your defense. And Aaron Rodgers has played very well under Nathaniel Hackett's system in Green Bay. I guess it was Matt LaFleur's system, but you presume Hackett's going to install a similar system with Aaron Jones in the backfield. So you think about what the Jets could do with Breece Hall if Rodgers is there. Suddenly defenses really have to be worried about Rodgers making a big play. The Jets turning into a splash play offense in the passing game, making big plays through the air. Suddenly you can't key on Breece Hall. And teams were doing that on Breece Hall, and he was still having success even when he was the focal point of the Jets offense. Now imagine an offense where he's not the guy you have to worry about. Maybe Garrett Wilson moves to the next level. An excellent rookie season for Garrett Wilson, over 1,000 yards. Finally a rookie performs at that level for the Jets in the Rookie of the Year. But could he get to that next level? It's one thing to be a 1,000, 1,100 yard guy. It's another to be a 1,500, 1,600 yard guy. And again, Garrett Wilson did this year without the benefit of much in the way of quarterback play. I don't even know if I'm going to go tight ends, but maybe Rodgers couldn't make the Jets tight ends that great, but there are lots of guys who would benefit, especially in the receiving game. And I think there is a benefit to the defense because the defense essentially this year knew that they really had to hold the other team's offense down. I really do believe that there is an effect here. I've never seen whether it's proven or not, but I think it's tough when you're an offense and your defense can't get a stop and you have to go out and score 30, 35 every game to win. And I think that the reverse is true. I think it's tougher to play defense when you don't have any margin for error. I think it makes you potentially take less risk. I think it weighs on you. And I think beyond that, it probably plays a mental role. It probably has a mental impact where we've seen it. We've seen it, you go back to the Rex days where it divides the locker room a little bit. It makes everything difficult. It impacts team chemistry. And, if the Jets get an offense in here who can score points, if the Jets get a quarterback who plays at an MVP level, then while there's an open question of how good Rodgers is going to be, there certainly is a boom scenario where he goes out and does it, and suddenly the Jets have an offense and they have a defense, and then they could make noise. It's an appealing scenario. And listen, I understand, even though I'm not wild about the idea of trading for Aaron Rodgers, I understand why people want to do it. I mean, I feel a little silly sometimes when I sit here and tell you I'm not a big fan of potentially trading for Rodgers, because if you disagree with me, well, you're the one saying, well, the Jets should go get a future Hall of Fame quarterback who just won the MVP a couple of years ago. Imagine being in my shoes and saying that that's not a great idea. Sometimes you feel a little bit silly, and maybe, I don't know, it's possible I'm overthinking it. And like I said, I always like to present all sides of a scenario. So this is the scenario where the Jets make out well with Rodgers, and in the interest of giving you the full story, I wanted to lay out that scenario because I don't think it's necessarily a lock, even though I'm not wild about it. I don't think it's necessarily a lock that this turns out poorly for the Jets. I think that there's a pathway. So, and if it happens, then that will be the optimism I choose to follow, because we all want to see the Jets win here. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're listening on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.